Good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss how we can migrate data centers into Azure. Today, we're going to discuss a little bit at a high level some tools that makes migrating a more streamlined process, and it's just not a daunting task, right? Taking your public cloud and your private cloud workloads and moving it into Azure and doing it in an expedient manner, right? Not taking years to migrate, but do it within months. I will discuss some caveats for moving workloads into Azure and why some workloads are best suited for the Azure public cloud. A little bit of background about me, some little housekeeping of who I am. I'm a cloud solutions architect at Logicworks. I'm primarily focused on Azure. I'm expert certified in the Azure space. Originally from New Jersey, but now reside in South Texas. Had to get away from the snow and ice in 6 months of winter. I have 25 plus years in IT. Been wearing a couple of hats, mainly in the sales side and SE and cloud architect, but I go back to sysadmin, developer, DBA, even some mainframe kind of experience I had over the years. Huge sports fan, love to talk sports with fellow enthusiasts. My LinkedIn profile is below. I'm going to discuss an overview of the Azure Migrate tool. Some of you probably have used that tool. It's been out for a few years now, but essentially we'll go over its capabilities. And basically, how do I know if I'm ready to migrate to Azure? There's another tool that allows you to take an assessment to see if you're ready to migrate your workloads up. We'll talk about that tool at a high level. Also, how to basically map application dependencies to resource before migrating. That's a big one, right? Today, in this day of the Great Resignation, IT personnel is leaving the company, right? And the IT personnel that originally deployed your environment might no longer be with your company nowadays. And so essentially, you bring in a new hire, a new team, and trying to make sense of what applications are installed on what resources and what cloud and how they basically interact with each other in the environment. And so these are important things when you migrate into any public cloud, even Azure specifically, because you don't want to miss VMs, but certain VMs might need to be grouped together because they're essential for application functionality. So we'll go through that little feature that was added last year to the Azure Migrate tool. So some benefits from migrating to Azure. And basically, how can I make sure I'm ready to migrate to Azure, right? So let's talk about the benefits, right? One big benefit of Azure is that Windows workloads work seamlessly in the Azure ecosystem, right? There's really isn't any thinking outside the box with regards to identity, security, management, deployment, PowerShell, ARM templates, Terraform, everything kind of works for Windows. There's really no thinking outside of the box. Deploy an agent, it works with the platform. Linux workloads work just as well as well. So Azure Platform allows customers to run a full Linux environment without issue, whether that's Kubernetes, you're running Zookeeper clusters, whatever you're running, this can work in Azure with no issues. Most of my customers are mixed that I see in the industry. It's either 80-20, 80% Windows, 20% Linux, or 80% Linux, 20% Windows. And it goes hand in hand. It's a platform that really gives you flexibility in deploying. Financially, Azure will optimize your costs by leveraging some of their cloud commit capabilities and license mobility services. So Azure has a lower upfront investment in standing up your servers in your data center. You pay for what you use, but you can extend that savings by leveraging reserved instances in Azure, by doing a 1 year or 3 year commit up front or monthly into that. So you pay for the compute up front, or you can do the same for reserve capacity for database as a service offerings like Azure SQL, managed instances, PaaS services like app service plans. You can pay for that compute for 1 year, 3 year up front, and essentially you have flexibility. So if you need to hire or bigger instance, you can buy into that, and your reservation still covers it. For EA enterprise agreement customers, you have a hub program. It's the hybrid use benefit program that will allow you to move your Windows licensing into Azure, so you don't have to pay that monthly cost for the Windows license on top of the compute cost for the actual VM. So that is given to you as an EA customer and other customers that have license mobility capabilities. From a capacity benefit, you don't have to capacity plan for hypervisor resources, SAN resources, NAS resources, dedicated servers to scale in your data center in Azure, right? That is given to you as a benefit and a perk of being in Azure. I know when you have a private cloud, those are the things you have to think about. Azure allows you to scale these resources quickly and allows you to scale those resources down. You don't have to wait for the SAN array to get in or a new shelf to be put in place so I can have more storage for my data stores, right? Those kind of go out the window when you move to Azure. There's also a business flexibility perk because you get to adapt to changing circumstances in your business in the public cloud. You get to bring on new business units, clients. You can handle peak load for your retail website, quickly decommission resources once you move into the Azure space. And this goes for any public cloud that you get to migrate to. If you need to figure out what you need to do to prepare for your Microsoft Azure migration, right, and to basically get you on your way on your Azure journey, there's a tool called the Strategic Migration Assessment and Readiness Tool. Microsoft coins it the SMART tool. I didn't name this. This is the name that was given to it. You have the ability to pick an area of focus. These are some questions that they'll be asked: business strategy, inventory and assets, business goals, migration plans, governance that you have in place. You get to pick and choose these focus areas or just basically answer all the questions in the assessment. When you're finished, you receive a report that identifies areas for improvement and resources that can help you make those improvements. And then once you make those improvements, you can come back to this tool and run the assessment again to see where you're at from a progress standpoint for your migration readiness. It's a free tool. The link is below. I can put that in the chat later if you're interested. So Azure Migrate. Basically, what is Azure Migrate and how can it help you migrate into Azure, right? Essentially, it's a centralized migration hub tool. It's an all-in-one tool that allows you to discover workloads in almost any location, AWS, GCP, private cloud. It doesn't matter where it's at. It'll just discover those workloads, usually with an agent or agentless. And it will assess those workloads to see what is necessary for what you have to do to migrate it into Azure, whether there's some end-of-life OSs or whatever. You get to assess these workloads, see if there's an image for it, and then if you're ready to go, then you can start that migrate process, and that can be done in phases or all in one. A little bit more of a deep dive. The discovery process allows a client to retrieve application inventory, server metadata, and dynamic performance data in their environment. That assessment basically provides performance recommendations of sizing in Azure for specific VM types or database as a service sizing for any database migration. This is crucial for any kind of right sizing standpoint, because if you have oversubscribed VMs, you can be paying for VMs with high core counts, and they're only being used 20 to 30% resource utilization in the environment. You pay a penalty by sending oversubscribed VMs into Azure. Because the cost is going to be more as the core count and memory count of that VM grows. So in the private cloud world, it's normal to have these oversubscribed VMs because you have the resources available to you from the hypervisor, right? You can allocate your CPU and RAM on the fly. It doesn't really matter. You don't pay a penalty for that. But when you go to Azure, if you have a 16 core VM and you have 128 gigs of RAM associated to it, then it's going to be a costly VM. More so than when you run it on-prem. So it's good to get a right-sized VM to migrate into Azure and scale it up based on dependent need of resources, and then scale it down when it's necessary. This is how you save money when you move to the public cloud in Azure specifically. And the migration can be done in phases. You can leverage failover groups for small to full-scale production environments. Along with dev tests, UAT, and QA environments, you can move with this Azure Migrate tool. So why should you use the tool? It's free, number one. You don't have to pay for it. But it allows for easy lift and shift migrations of on-prem resources, whether it's physical servers or virtual machines. Azure Migrate allows you to replicate workloads in Azure through a mobility service that's installed on the VM or instance, and there will be a replication appliance of some sorts that lives in your environment. It's a process configuration server. Essentially takes whatever image that you have and just makes it a Azure VM image and puts in a storage account in Azure. This is done through port 443. So this philosophy can still be applied to any kind of DR that you want to migrate. So if you have a DR in SunGuard and you have a DR sitting in Equinix or a colo facility and you want to move it to Azure, you would leverage this Azure Migrate tool to just basically replicate that into Azure, and you would deploy a landing zone, and then that would be your new DR footprint instead of using a colo facility. And essentially, it leveraged Azure Site Recovery for some capabilities of replication. It's not Azure Site Recovery; it's kind of just bundled in the Azure Migrate tool. It uses some components of that. So essentially, it shouldn't be confused as ASR because that was the original method of doing a failover kind of migration into Azure before Azure Migrate came on the scene 3 or 4 years ago. So let's take an example of a large regional bank, right? They want to migrate to DCs by the end of 2022. The infrastructure supports over 40 branch locations. There's 300 VMs with little standardization. And by chance, you do not have access to source code for most apps. First thing you're going to say, oh, well, Azure Migrate, this tool that we just discussed, that can do most of the work for me. But unfortunately, there's some other things that you have to take in account when you do a migration into Azure. And one thing is landing zone. Landing zone requirements need to be flushed out in place before any migration is done. Because Azure Migrate will move those into a storage account in Azure. But once you have it there and you do your failover, you need a VNet deployed and some subnets deployed so your VMs can go to the appropriate VNets and subnets to work. And essentially, you'll need to discuss IP site range with your NetSec team or network security team. You're going to have non-overlapping existing IP addresses. You're going to need to have resource groups deployed for your resources, subnets, availability sets, availability zones, network security groups, and so forth for these additional things that need to be in your landing zone. But also, VPN connections, site to sites, point to sites, express routes, those need to be established too as well. And express routes take a very long time to put in place because you have to work with third parties, ISPs like Megaport or Equinix to get these express routes in place. And it's usually for those big workloads that take a long time to migrate to the public cloud. So you can do a replication of host space VMs into Azure easily. But if you have petabytes or terabytes of flat files, they're sitting on a SAN device or a NAS device, and you need to move those into Azure, there's only a couple ways you can do that, right? There's the import-export tool that allows you to get a seed device into your data center. You seed it, you send it to Azure, and they will just populate that into the Azure Object Storage, which is blob storage. Or you can just use some sort of copy tool to replicate those files over your express route into the storage account, and it's probably going to be a lot faster to do it in that transport method. So how can I map out application dependencies to resources in my environment? We talked a little bit about that earlier. This newly added feature is called the Dependency Analysis tool. This feature allows you to visualize application dependencies between resources, and you can deploy agents on your VMs for this, or you can go agentless by deploying the Azure Migrate appliance to your environment. And this gathers this information and allows you to identify workloads that must be migrated together, but you also can eliminate easily resources that are not being used and safely decommission those resources before migrating them to Azure. And I've seen this numerous times. I'm going to go full boat. I want to move all 300 VMs, but maybe 50 of those VMs were sandbox VMs, were never being used. And so you're paying for those VMs in Azure, even though you're not using them, you still have an image, so there's still a cost to them. So you can get ahead of that, right? And you can actually visualize this if you have that Power BI SME in-house. You can actually leverage Power BI to visualize these network connections from a dependency analysis feature that is in the Azure Migrate tool. And you can see a picture of how that works. You can see the processes, you can see the ports, what VMs are dependent upon it, so you can get a visualization of how that looks. So we'll talk about the sausage making process of the Azure Migrate appliance, right? If you leverage this appliance for dependency mappings, right, the appliance has to collect the metadata of the servers on the vCenter server. Now you can use this for Hyper-V too as well, but it uses the APIs of vSphere in this example right here. It connects to port 443, which is the default port, and you can use any other port for vCenter server listens on. So we use 8443, you can change that port easily. It takes that data, that raw metadata, and migrates it over to the server discovery service in Azure on port 443. So once it gathers the data, it ships it to the server discovery service. So when you run the assessment with the Azure Migrate tool, or you run the migration, it pulls that data down and brings it into the tool. But if you have a security guy in-house that doesn't want your data going over the public internet in 443, you can actually send the traffic through an express route that you have set up through private peering, or you can do it through public peering, which is called Microsoft peering now, instead of using that 443 port. So you have a couple ways of getting that data into Azure. Also, if you have SQL Server in-house, Azure Migrate appliance works in the same manner. It connects to the discovered SQL Server instances that you have. It collects the configuration performance data of the SQL Server database environment. And then that configuration data is gathered and used to identify migration blockers. And this is key. So if you're going to leverage SQL Server and you're going to move it to Azure SQL, or you're going to use managed instances or whatever you're going to use as a database as a service offering, this allows you to get ahead of issues that you need to do, where there can be stored procedures, indexes that got to be rebuilt, some code that's in SQL Server, so DMVs are no longer used depending on what version of SQL Server you're using. It will tell you what you need to fix before you migrate it. Also, it will give you performance data, right? It will include IOPS, latency, CPU utilization. It will tell you this information so you can right-size your database as a service offering Azure SQL managed instance size that you're going to use for SQL Server. And why this is important is because SQL Server is probably the main driver of cost in your environment. And because the licensing for SQL Server is based on cores, you don't want to take an oversubscribed SQL Server, put it in Azure, and pay that cost. You kind of want to get ahead of it. So this will basically right-size those features for you. And essentially, if you're going to go to Azure SQL or you're going to go to managed instance, those resources can scale on demand without taking an outage. So you can actually grow your SQL Server to get more database horsepower to handle more of the ingestion of data that's going in, and you can just self-heal it when you don't need that anymore. You can discover up to 6,000 databases or 300 instances with a single appliance. But if you have a situation that you have more than 300 instances, which I've only seen once in my career, you can scale discovery further by deploying more appliances in your environment. So just essentially, I want to wrap up. Logicworks is a leading provider in cloud migration and managed services. If you're interested in migrating to Azure and need assistance, contact us and we can get a discussion together with me, myself, or some other peers to talk about our cloud migration services. If you need a second pair of eyes, we can conduct a free assessment of the existing environment that you're migrating to Azure. And once the migration is completed, we can help keep the lights on with our cloud operations managed services that we offer. We're a Gold partner of Microsoft and we're an Azure Expert MSP. Our contact number and website are below. I want to just thank you for your time. I hope to speak with some of you in the future. I'll add my information in the chat. We can do a Q&A. I think we have some questions in here.